Hey you guys, it's Zach, and I'm back with something a bit different for this channel, a woodworking video. This started off as an idea to fill empty wall space after I built and mounted a folding table to the wall and realized that staring at an empty wall every meal wasn't the most enjoyable activity. So I went to the box store and I bought some 1x4x10 boards of whitewood, which, as I understand it, is similar to pine but stains nicer. Well, at least I had hoped it would. So here's a picture of my drawn plans and a picture of all the finished cuts that I had made probably about a year and a half ago at this point. Unfortunately, I had lost motivation after cutting the wood, and it may have sat in my basement for over a year and warped. That's an issue that'll come up later. Another problem I quickly realized when I came back to this project was I don't have a workbench, and I really don't have a flat surface big enough to hold this project level. That's another issue that'll come up later. So I sanded all my boards to 150 grit with marble sander, and then I needed to decide what kind of joinery I wanted to use. And I kind of did something a bit different for each type of joint in the project, which you'll see here in a bit. The first thing I did when I came back was I decided to miter the joints on the frame, glue it up, and then I bought a miter dowel jig and I tried that out. I found that it wasn't too difficult to set up and it worked as advertised. However, my glue skills were not up to par, which is another problem I suppose that we will come back to. I sawed off the excess dowels with a flush cut saw and then sanded them down so they were flush. So now that the frame was together, I needed to decide how I was going to joint the other vertical boards and line up the rabbet cuts for the shelves. I didn't have any chisels, but I had a straight cut bit and a router, so that's what I ended up using for the rabbet cuts. Using some Google Foo, I built a rabbet jig, which you can use to get the exact thickness of the board that you want to cut for, and then you can clamp that down to the board where you're putting your rabbet cuts into, and then make your cuts. With some help from the wife holding up the frame, and hours upon hours of measuring, I made my cuts on the left and right frame boards. Then I made the measurements and marks on the vertical frame boards in the middle, and I made my cuts. Then I used a dowel centering jig to drill some dowels into the vertical frame, and I glued in the dowels, which was another mistake, as I had planned to use these inserts where it's like a pointy end that you stick into the drilled dowel holes on your board, and you push those into the board that you are going to joint them to, and it perfectly marks where you need to drill that board. So that was awesome. So what I ended up doing to fix this was I put double-sided tape on the dowels and I marked them with a Sharpie and then pressed it up against the frame, moving the double-sided tape to the frame to find my drill points. Now you combine that with an uneven work surface and I ran into some problems, but ultimately I was able to get the joints together by hooking together two pipe clamps. Here you can see a picture of the completed frame with the empty rabbets. So next, I test fit for the shelves and realized just how bad the vertical boards had warped after sitting in the basement for a year, and I was unfortunately able to confirm that with a long straight edge that I had. So what I had found after fiddling around was that the miters were flexible enough to bend a bit when I glued the shelves, creating a square enough box. That meant I had to shorten a few of the shelves though. So I glued two shelves at a time using pipe clamps for each shelf, and I did a poor job wiping excess glue, which will once again cause some problems later. Here are some pictures of the glue up and fit. Some of the joints came together better than others, but overall not bad for my first time experimenting with rabbet joints. In the future, I'm going to try hand chiseling the rabbet joints for a tighter fit. So next, I took some sawdust from the sander and some wood glue to fill some of the joints, and for some reason, the sawdust came out of the sander gray. I'm not really sure what happened there. I tried taking some shavings from the router and mixing that in, but ultimately it just didn't work. Luckily, the stain I used later is dark enough to mostly cover it, but at the time, I was not very happy. I also, once again, did a bad job of wiping the excess glue, which will come back to bite me later. The mixture set way faster than normal wood glue, so it was much harder to wipe off. After this, I let the project sit for a few days for the glue to cure. After some sanding, dusting, and wiping off the wood with a damp cloth to get the dust off, it was time for the moment of glory, the stain. Now the stain is a double-edged sword because it really shows the beauty of the wood and you kind of start to see the finish line for the project. However, the stain also shows you all of your mistakes along the way, which can be pretty frustrating. I try to remember that mistakes are part of the journey and most won't even notice the same mistakes that you do. Now I don't have pictures of it, but I used a pre-stain conditioner on the wood about 20 minutes before staining to raise the grain. Now I found it helps tremendously when staining pine, so I figured I'd use it on the whitewood. Once that had set, I started with a Minwax dark walnut stain, which matches the dining table and a nearby shelf in the kitchen. I used scrap wood to raise the shelf a few inches so it wouldn't stick to the MDF. Now it's probably more important when you're applying the finish, but I figured it couldn't hurt for the stain. So when applying the stain, I tried to take the project in sections, and I started with the spots that'd be most visible and looked at the most. What I've learned from staining is I prefer to use a cloth instead of a brush, as I find it's much less messy and I have more control over what I'm doing. You want to get the stain into the cloth first, then wipe into the wood. In the past, I would just pour stain onto the wood and then brush it out, but that creates uneven dark and light spots that you really don't want. I use the same concept when I'm applying my finish as well. You also make less of a mess and you're less likely to spill off of your project, I've found. Another tip I found is to apply your stain in broad strokes, ideally with the grain. But you really just don't want to use a circular motion to avoid those dark and light spots that I was talking about earlier. I only did one coat of the stain, but if you want a darker finish, you can apply a second coat. You want to make sure to wipe up any excess stain after a few minutes, especially if you do a second coat. The wood can only absorb so much and it'll be sticky if you don't. Sorry I don't have more pictures from the staining. Staining is usually the most stressful part for me, and I was trying to use full focus. So I let the stain set for a few days, then I began planning out the finish. I found that we get enough sunlight in our kitchen that using a full gloss finish can be a bit blinding. So what I did was I started with 3 coats of Minwax Wipe-On Clear Gloss Poly. This is the shiny stuff. Then I finished with a warm semi-gloss poly. I used a cloth to apply every coat, even if the can doesn't say it's Wipe-On, still use a cloth. And then I sanded with a high grit sandpaper in between each coat. Side note, once again, wiping off with a wet cloth to get the dust off, huge tip for any newbie woodworkers like myself. You can see in this video just how well it works. So I let the poly cure for a few days after the final coat. And then the wife helped me flip the project over so I could plan out installing the keyhole hangers. So I used my tape measure up in the kitchen to find how high I needed the hangers to be to hang the project over the table. Then I used a straight edge level to mark a point on each vertical board. On my test piece, I quickly found that without a chisel and using normal wood drill bits, it was not working quite well. So I ran back to the box store and I grabbed a pack of Forstner bits, and these things were a godsend. I found the bit which was just as wide as the keyhole hanger. Then I marked a template for the hardware on the wood, and I got to drilling. You can see in the picture the Forstner bit and the keyhole hanger in the wood. The hardware I picked out for the hanger was more rectangular and oblong in shape than what I've seen others using, and I think it was a lot harder to work with than it could have been. In the future, I'll just buy circular keyhole hangers and I'll only have to drill once instead of spending hours trying to get this fit perfect. So now I needed to get the anchors into the wall and line up with the keyhole hangers on the project. This is something I had not considered until this very moment, and it was quite challenging. What I decided to do was clamp down a straight edge to the project at a perfect 90-degree angle to the straightest edge of the project, and I followed that straight edge with masking tape over the hangers. Then I took a Sharpie and I drew circles on the tape where I wanted the screws. Since I already knew how high I needed the hangers to be from the table by my measurements earlier, I took a straight edge and a square up with me to the dining table, and I started trying to get the tape on the wall by myself. I quickly found it was very difficult to do that, as I don't quite have the 7-foot wingspan from my NBA dreams. So the wife came to my rescue again, and we were able to get the tape up at the correct height and level. I then took my drill, my anchors, and screws, and I started poking holes into the wall. I did decide to move the project a few inches off center from the table, so I was able to mount at least one keyhole into a stud instead of just an anchor. I probably didn't need to do this as the white wood is very light, but I just didn't want to have to worry about it later. So then, we carefully carried the project up from the basement and into the kitchen. We held it up to the anchors and their screws, where I then breathed a huge sigh of relief when I found out that they were right where they should be. Let's just say I've made some mistakes before. At this point, it's trial and error to find just how far your screw heads need to be out from the wall to get a good hang. So my next tip for DIYers and woodworkers is to understand that there's no perfectly square rooms or straight walls, especially in my house. I blame the drywall guys. The key is to curb your expectations for yourself and realize that you aren't a carpenter and it doesn't need to be perfect. If you are a carpenter, please don't dislike my video, but feel free to tell me about all my mistakes. So now, we crack a step 2, shout out to Steve Wallace, and sit back and enjoy the new shelving. Wait, what's that? I didn't install hangers near the bottom of the shelves so it's wobbly if someone bumps into it? Well, if I ever get to taking it down, I'll put a few more hangers in the back and a few more anchors in the wall. For now, my workspace is finally clear and I'm moving on to bigger and better things. I hope you all enjoyed the video and take care.